As women, we often struggle to understand our historical value because we have so many narratives telling us we didn't have any value. For example, I came across this quote:
Each time a girl opens a book and reads a womanless history, she learns she is worth less.
But why would we limit our perceptions to what we read in books? Because if we go on the internet and do a little research, we find that women have always been tremendously valuable to society. Today, we don't know our history because for the last century, men and women had a vested interest in hiding it from us. So in this video, I'll show you the influence, power, and value women historically held. Then I'll explain why, after we were enfranchised, we chose to give it away. So buckle up, ladies, because knowing our full history forces us to look in the mirror and finally decide, do we really want the rights and power that are inherently ours? The main reason we don't see our value is because we've accepted a value system that says women who had babies, raised children, and did domestic chores didn't serve society as well as men who invented, created, and changed society. Inventions that change society do make men sound more valuable. However, we're forgetting one very important historical fact.
I draw a line at 1945 and remember that before then, people were focused on survival and perpetuating society. Avoiding death was a part of daily life. It's estimated that even in 1900, 60% of children didn't reach adulthood, and life expectancy was less than 50. Biology tells us that for a society to thrive, women's lives had to be valued and protected. Men, however, were more expendable. They could take risks and do the dangerous work outside the home. The most dangerous endeavor, of course, was war. But men weren't alone. Women were camp followers who did domestic chores such as laundry, cooking, sewing, and bathing wounded soldiers. In the mid-19th century, women like Florence Nightingale and Clara Barton helped create nursing as a female profession. While we learned that nursing was valuable to care for wounded soldiers, we never learned the rest of the story. We didn't learn about the United States Sanitation Commission and how its army of women ran the sanitation efforts in army camps in order to combat disease, or how women organized and ran sanitation fairs all over the country to support the effort, or how after the war, thousands of women worked through their women's clubs and applied what they learned to domestic life. They went house to house, teaching mothers about sanitation, food safety, and health care. It was women who improved health and sanitation in the home and brought down childhood mortality rates. We also didn't learn that it was skilled midwives who emphasized sanitation who reduced the childbirth mortality rates for both mothers and infants. Meanwhile, some of the most prominent male doctors believed that nature intended mothers to die in childbirth. Therefore, it required their heroic mechanical intervention to save women. In their arrogance, they didn't consider how their intervention and lack of sanitation caused the infections that kept mortality rates high.
So yes, women's traditional role centered around the home and family was critical to a society still focused on survival. So you would think we would have a day of recognition to remind us of our historical value. Oh wait, we do. It's called Mother's Day.
Before being hijacked by commercialism, Mother's Day was created by Anna Jarvis to commemorate and honor her mother and the work of thousands of mothers like hers who improved the health and well-being of countless families and communities.
As women, we should be proud of our history and our traditional role, because while men helped make life more comfortable, women made longer and healthier lives possible, and that's incredibly valuable. But wait, our historical value didn't just come from our traditional role, it also came from our classical role. Today, most women have no idea what I mean by our classical role. That's because after World War II, we abandoned it and gave it to men. And that's the dirty little secret we've been covering up ever since. So let's understand what our classical role is, why it's valuable, and most importantly, Why on earth we gave it to men and let them strengthen their patriarchal power.
Our classical role is rooted in ancient Greek and Roman culture. It begins with the 4 cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. These virtues are the foundation of good moral character and living an honorable life. And if you notice, women personify the virtues.
Throughout the classics, women personified our virtues, values, and higher aspirations.
This is because historically, women were credited with greater moral integrity than men. Society understood that men's nature was motivated by self-interest, which often had dark and negative consequences. However, as women, we naturally saw beyond ourselves. We saw how our actions affected others. So in our classical role, we used our moral superiority to influence men to set aside their self-interest and to act for the greater and common good.
We find women's moral superiority throughout American history.
In 1775, an educated young slave and poet named Phillis Wheatley popularized Columbia, the female personification of America, who embodies all of our ideals and aspirations. In her poem to His Excellency George Washington, Phillis describes a powerful Columbia who uses her moral courage to stand up against tyranny. And Phillis is bold in her counsel to Washington when she writes, "Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide." Phyllis's classical education taught her that even the greatest of men can't achieve the American ideals on their own. They need feminine influence to guide them. So for 150 years, Phyllis's Columbia reminded Americans of our greater principles, aspirations, and ideals. During the height of Columbia's popularity, women used their moral superiority to live up to the ideals of our classical role. They were actively involved in the Revolution, forming a government, and social issues, including abolition, universal suffrage, women's rights, health and sanitation, poverty, corruption, immigration, and labor.
Throughout the 19th century, women's classical role was empowered by the doctrine of true womanhood. Women who had few legal rights used true womanhood to assert their moral superiority and become an unstoppable force.
True womanhood encompassed the 4 virtues of piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. The most important of these is piety, which openly declared women's moral superiority over men. This virtue gave women power because defying women meant defying the will of God. Women then acted through their purity, submissiveness to God, and domesticity to elevate men's behavior so men would then use their power in society, commerce, and government for the common good instead of self-interests. Empowered by their moral superiority, 19th century women constantly meddled in men's public sphere with their municipal housekeeping. To make matters worse, a woman sat on the throne of the most powerful nation in the world, and she refused to abdicate.
All of this feminine power frustrated men and made them anxious about their patriarchal power. Women proved to be a powerful force even without legal rights. And nothing proved this more than the temperance movement.
The temperance movement united women across all social reform efforts because alcohol abuse was rampant and causing enormous social harm. So using just their moral superiority and power of influence, women convinced a majority of men to vote for a constitutional amendment that banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol in order to support the greater and common good.
In 1919, prohibition seemed to signal the end of patriarchal power, especially since the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, also passed both houses of Congress. But men weren't giving up that easily. They always knew that women would eventually get the right to vote, so decades earlier they began executing a 2-part plan to keep their power. That way, when women did get the right to vote, it really didn't matter to them. You see, men aren't dumb. They knew that as long as women had moral superiority, women would have influence and power. So in the first part of their plan, men had to move moral superiority from women to men. And one way they did that was by using this guy.
Uncle Sam was around in various forms as long as Columbia, but it wasn't until the Civil War that he emerged as the personification of the United States federal government, often reflecting its ineptness. At first, Uncle Sam needed Columbia's guidance and counsel to remind him of our values. But then his image began to change. He became stronger, a leader among the world's greatest powers, and eventually a hero. He personified the greatness of patriarchal power. Meanwhile, Columbia's image became more maternal. She became the woman behind the great man, cheering him on. By World War I, Columbia was little more than a recruiting aid and fundraiser. Uncle Sam replaced her as the powerful face of America.
Our other female icons suffered a similar fate, so today we don't see them representing our classical role and moral superiority. Instead, we see them the way the patriarchy wants us to see them.
Constructed throughout the 19th century, the U.S. Capitol has many pieces of classical art. In this art, women personify our American ideals and values. They are a reminder of women's historic and classical role. The most important piece is the Statue of Freedom, which stands on top of the dome. But how many people know freedom is personified by a woman, or that it is a woman with shield and sword in hand who stands vigilant, ready to protect the nation and its values? Likewise, Liberty Enlightening the World was designed breaking free of the shackles of slavery so she could shine the light of freedom on oppressed people across the 7 seas, encouraging them to rise up against their oppressors. But that message didn't support the image of an Uncle Sam who gathered people from around the world and brought them under his paternal protective care. So in the early 20th century, Liberty Enlightening the World became the Statue of Liberty. Her name change emphasized her need to stay home so she could welcome Uncle Sam's new children and fulfill her proper maternal role.
But no female icon had her image transformed as much as Justice.
At the United States Supreme Court, we'd expect to see a valiant image of Justice prominently displayed. But the Supreme Court was constructed in the 1930s just as men were cementing their claim on moral superiority, and that's reflected in the design. The famous Western pediment isn't a tribute to Justice. It's actually a tribute to the men who were influential in building the court. And that's liberty in the center, not justice. Likewise, the Eastern pediment with its inscription, Justice, the Guardian of Liberty, doesn't even show justice or liberty. Instead, the design is a tribute to the 3 great Eastern civilizations, represented by men, that established law as an element of civilization.
Amazingly, the Supreme Court has only 3 images of justice, and they're hard to find.
The first image of Justice is located inside the courtroom on the West Wall frieze. As a force of goodness, Justice leans on a sheathed sword as she stares down the forces of evil. But did I mention this frieze is on the back wall of the courtroom, where no one looks? It's the East Wall frieze that's directly above the bench. It features 2 men representing the majesty of law and the power of government. To their left, the cardinal virtue of wisdom is portrayed as a man. Likewise, the other friezes also feature men. The north wall portrays the development of law, while the south wall is a procession of the great lawgivers of history. The other 2 images of Justice are located on the building exterior. The first is easy to miss because she's at the bottom of the steps. In a womanly role, Justice decorates the lampposts. Looking around for a commanding image of Justice, we'd assume she's that large statue of a woman on the steps. But that's not Justice. That's the contemplation of Justice, who, according to the sculptor, is a heroic type of person with the head and body expressive of the beauty and intelligence of justice. Notice it's a feminine form who is forever contemplating. And that conforms to the female stereotype that says even intelligent women are too indecisive to act. It's also this form that's holding the third image of justice. Held captive by the feminine form, justice is also unable to act. Notice her scales are folded so she can't do her job, and she's blindfolded so she can't see. And where the heck is her sword? Oh, there it is. It was given to a man. This statue is the authority of law, who according to the sculptor is powerful, erect, and vigilant. He waits with concentrated attention, and he holds a tablet of laws backed by a sheathed sword symbolic of enforcement through law.
Whew, that is quite the patriarchal takeover of justice. But men weren't done there. They knew that to claim moral superiority, they had to personify justice, because justice is the highest virtue. It requires the incorporation of courage, temperance, and wisdom. So men stripped justice of her feminine qualities, changed her image, and then changed our concept of how justice is achieved. And they did all that using a blindfold.
In her classical role, because she's a woman, justice is clear-sighted. She sees everything that's going on around her. She sees the balance of her scales. She sees where she needs to use her sword to both defend and dispense justice. As a virtue, she's a higher ideal we strive for within ourselves, so as united individuals, we create a just society that works for the common good. But when men took over justice, they introduced self-interest. So to make us believe they fixed their impartiality problem, they slapped a blindfold on justice. But we need to ask ourselves, how can a blindfolded justice see the corruption and prejudice around her? How can she see the balance of her scales or accurately swing a sword? It makes no sense. So our modern image of justice isn't about the virtue of individuals in a society. Instead, it's about empowering a paternalistic institution of select and superior individuals who pass judgment in order to create a just society on our behalf.
There were a lot of changes in the early 20th century that empowered the patriarchy. And they beg a question. After so many women fought for so long to enfranchise our power and influence so we could then better society, how could we abandon it so quickly and let the patriarchy take over again? Well, the answer is what I said earlier. Men aren't dumb. In the second part of their plan, they simply encouraged us to choose to give up our empowerment and choose to empower the patriarchy. Sound crazy? Maybe, but it worked. You see, men understood a basic principle. With rights come responsibility. And men knew many women didn't want the responsibility.
Let's remember that for most of human history, married couples were self-reliant, working in or around the home. Life was hard, and to survive, they functioned as one entity, sharing the family labor and responsibilities. Industrialization changed that. It split the family. Men left home to work in the public sphere, while women remained in the home sphere to care for the children and do the domestic work. We were told this division was natural and proper, but it also served a society still focused on survival because it kept women safe and made us a protected class. As a protected class, we were exempt from many responsibilities. Our husband was responsible for providing the family income, bearing the family burdens, and taking care of us. We lost most of our self-reliance because we now bought many of the commodities we once raised and made ourselves. We became more dependent. Ironically, we saw our dependency as a good thing because it gave us our feminine privilege, and we wanted as much feminine privilege as possible.
So to disempower enfranchised women, men simply asked if we really wanted to give up our feminine privilege. Did we really want to go back to a more arduous life? Did we really want to take on the burdens and responsibilities of the public sphere? You know, that place is full of cutthroat businessmen.
Did women really want to tangle with these men? Now, there were some women like Hetty Green who held her own with the robber barons and made herself one of the wealthiest Gilded Age tycoons. But she was also known as the Witch of Wall Street and the world's greatest miser. Did women really want to give up their feminine privilege to be like her? Other women went into the public sphere to fight for women's suffrage and social issues. However, the women who got the attention and made history were radical and used militant behavior. Did women really want to be like them? Men were also helped in their efforts by the anti-woman suffrage movement. The women who led this movement didn't want to give up their feminine privilege provided by their rich husbands. They aspired to their version of true womanhood, emphasizing domesticity, where servants did the housework and took care of the children, freeing them to devote their time to charitable work, the arts, leisure activities, and socializing. Didn't women really want to be like these women? Amazingly, even the common law practice of coverture enticed women to empower the patriarchy. Coverture said that when a man and woman married, they became one person, and that person was the husband. So a woman turned over all of her money and property to her husband. She also gave up her individual identity. But on the plus side, her feminine privilege said she shared in her husband's success and status. She didn't have to do anything valuable in society herself. She only had to marry the right man.
Now, encouraging women to stay in the home sphere wasn't without a few obstacles, because a growing industrialized society needed women to work.
Society needed women to fill jobs as nurses, teachers, and clerical workers, but it also needed women to eventually transition back to the home sphere. So to encourage women to get married, these female jobs paid low wages. And to force the issue, married women often face marriage bars, rules that banned them from working. But on the plus side, working gave women access to a wide range of eligible men who could give them a privileged life in the home sphere. Being a housewife was something to aspire to because good women married good men who allowed them to indulge in their feminine privilege. It was the unfortunate women who didn't marry or didn't marry well who needed to stay in the public sphere and work. And who wants to be one of them?
Another obstacle working against men and their patriarchal power was that women wanted enfranchisement and roles in government so we could finally address the social issues that negatively impacted women and children.
In 1929, the 71st Congress had an historic number of women, including Mary T. Norton, who emerged as a leader. But history best remembers her for telling off a male colleague, "I'm no lady, I'm a member of Congress."
But that wasn't her greatest accomplishment. And the fact that we don't know this part of women's history just proves how successful men were in making us believe they had moral superiority, so we would then choose to empower the patriarchy.
How many of us know that in 1935, Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, working with many prominent women's rights advocates, was the driving force behind the Social Security Act? Or that Secretary Perkins and her Ladies' Brain Trust then teamed up with Mary Norton, chairwoman of the House Labor Committee, for more legislation. We have Norton to thank for getting the Fair Labor Standards Act passed, which created many of the labor laws we now take for granted.
So who does history credit for all this? Men, of course.
Senator Hugo Black is credited for drafting the bill in 1932, even though his version never passed. But since he became a Supreme Court Justice in 1937, it's no surprise history credits him, so we can document his moral superiority and worthiness for his new position. And of course, President Roosevelt gets credit, even though at the time he really was busy trying to pack the courts in order to increase his presidential power.
As I keep saying, men aren't dumb. They knew the Great Depression gave them yet another opportunity to increase their patriarchal power, and they took it.
Many New Deal programs were designed to put men to work. They deliberately reinforced that men are the family breadwinners. As for women, our feminine privilege exposed our vulnerability. And as many of us struggled to survive, we needed hope. We needed to believe in the power of men and the patriarchy, that moral, virtuous men would protect us and take care of us. And history gave us that hope. Remember all those Gilded Age robber barons? Well, they became great philanthropists. So surely, powerful men can set aside their self-interest and act with moral integrity for the common good.
In order to protect our feminine privilege, we needed heroes. So, we were given heroes. Men who faced the dark realities of the moment and could wage war against the emergency. Men who knew the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. In reality, our heroes fell short of their image and our ideals. But World War II soon gave men another opportunity to prove their moral character.
Throughout World War II, men were true heroes who acted with moral and physical courage. They willingly sacrificed their own lives to defeat true evil. Heroism was no longer for a select few. It belonged to the common man, and every woman could have her own personal hero. So with the close of World War II, men sealed their claim on moral superiority and our classical role. Women were now gratefully exempt from most of life's responsibilities. We expected men to use their moral superiority to take care of us. And we were happy when they created new inventions that reduced the burden of our domestic chores, so more of us had leisure time and were free to indulge in our growing feminine privilege. We believed the pursuit of leisure was the same as the pursuit of happiness, but we soon found out it wasn't, and our mistake affected our self-worth. From the sidelines, we watched men create, invent, and change the world. We saw the pride that came from their accomplishments. And while we were supposed to share in our husband's achievements, the reality was it was his, not ours. So we had to face the reality that we were two distinct individuals and only one had value to society. We discovered that our traditional role was no longer valued because society was no longer focused on survival. Lower mortality rates and longer lifespans took care of that. Instead, society valued how man can achieve the impossible. Consequently, we felt left out and valueless. We didn't prepare to become accomplished. We prepared for a happy, fulfilling life as a housewife. We married younger than our mothers and grandmothers, so many of us never worked. If we went to college, we went for an MRS degree. We dropped out to get married or graduated with degrees that made us an ideal but frivolous wife. We felt betrayed and lied to.
When we're unhappy, it's hard to look in the mirror and admit our mistakes. So for women in the mid-20th century, it was hard to admit that they ignored the lessons generations of women tried to pass down to us.
In 1872, Elizabeth Cady Stanton delivered her famous speech, The Solitude of Self. She told us that the strongest reason for giving women all the opportunities is the solitude and personal responsibility of her own individual life. She warned us that no matter how much women prefer to lean to be protected and supported, nor how much men desire us to do so, we must make the journey of life alone. And that the greatest lesson nature always seems to teach us is self-dependence, self-protection, self-support.
We didn't want to admit that we chose not to be responsible for ourselves, or that Mrs. Stanton was right when she said, "Few women are willing to do the ordinary useful work for which they are fitted." Ouch. Since we weren't willing to admit our mistakes, we found others to blame.
We blamed men. But not all men. We needed to believe in virtuous men in powerful positions in order to justify giving them our classical role. We also blamed 19th century women and their cult of true womanhood, because once we gave men moral superiority, the virtues served their self-interest and oppressed us. Piety defines women as compassionate, nurturing, and well-suited for charitable work. Purity reminds us that men only marry virgins. Our submissiveness is to men, and domesticity prescribes that a woman's place is in the home, tending to her husband's needs.
We had to rewrite history. We couldn't acknowledge our historical moral superiority, power, or influence, and all the value that they brought to society, without also revealing that we chose to give it all up because we wanted to be exempt from responsibility. So we wrote new narratives. We cast ourselves as unempowered, subjugated victims of the patriarchy. We claimed that we needed new laws and policies to empower us and give us equality, even though our rights already existed, and all we needed to do was accept the responsibility that came with them. As 21st century women, we have to face our historical mistakes and get ourselves back on track. We have to decide to give up our feminine privilege because we are needed.
In 1915, Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, who you probably never heard of, gave one of the most important speeches of the 20th century, The Fundamental Principle of a Republic. It was based on the divine principle, "It's not good for man to stand alone." She argued for the equality of all people and their equal opportunity. She said, "This world does not owe anybody a living. What it does owe to every human being is the opportunity to earn a living. We have a right to the opportunity. We want it. No woman, any more than a man, has the right to live an idle life in this world. We must learn to give back something for the space occupied, and we must do our duty wherever duty calls. And the woman herself must decide where her duty calls, just as a man does." She concluded by saying, "You can no more build up homes without men than you can build up the state without women. We are needed everywhere where human problems are to be solved. Men and women must go through this world together from cradle to grave. It is God's way and the fundamental principle of a Republican form of government."
Wow. Imagine how much further along we'd be today if we had followed through on those words. But since we didn't, we let men continue to dominate the public sphere and claim it as their own. And over time, we lost generations of knowledge about the power and value of our feminine traits and why we need to bring them into the workplace, society, and government. Throughout my career, I learned that what Dr. Shaw said was right. So that's why I began The Woman in the Room, wrote my book, and make these videos. We can't afford to lose any more knowledge. Today, our traditional role won't dominate our lives, and we'll have many years left for other opportunities. So let's make the best of them.
Let's think bigger than our traditional opportunities in pink industries and pink jobs, because our greatest opportunities are wherever there are many men and few women. And as we move into new opportunities, we can't forget the duty of our classical role. We don't just work alongside men and adopt their behavior tainted by self-interest. We remember that in true womanhood, we use our power of influence to elevate behavior and transform our workplace, society, and government for the better. And that our pursuit of happiness is about becoming our best self and helping others to become their best self.
I've covered a lot in this video, and there's so much more, so I hope you continue to learn about the value women have always brought to society. Always remember how much women accomplished without rights or opportunities just because they decide to stand up and accept responsibility first. That's where our power and rights begin. I want to finish with a quote from Carrie Chapman Catt. In her speech celebrating women's right to vote, she addressed future generations of women.
The vote is the emblem of your equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. That vote of yours has cost millions of dollars and the lives of thousands of women. Money to carry on this work has been given, usually as a sacrifice, and thousands of women have gone without things they wanted and could have had in order that they might help get the vote for you. Women have suffered agony of soul, which you can never comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it. The vote is a power, a weapon of offense and defense, a prayer. Understand what it means and what it can do for your country. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. No soldier in this great suffrage army has labored and suffered to get a place for you. Their motive has been the hope that women would aim higher than their own selfish ambitions, that they would serve the common good. The vote is won. 72 years the battle for this privilege has been waged, but human affairs with their eternal change move on without pause. Progress is calling to you to make no pause. Act. This is Dot Callahan asking you to help me turn the woman in the room into the women in the room. Sign up for my newsletter, subscribe to my YouTube channel, or find the Woman in the Room on Facebook. It's up to you. Just keep watching and sharing my videos. To get advice from a woman who's been there, dealt with that, and knows what works.